Hello and welcome to Bookworm. This is Michael Silverblatt. Today my guest is Don DeLillo, the author most recently of Underworld. It's published by Scribner's. His books are, should I name them in order? Americana, End Zone, Great Drone Street, Ratner's Star, Players, Running Dog, The Names, White Noise, Libra, and Mao 2. Now, this book is full of symmetries, and I wanted to begin by noting that it opens and closes with miracles, a baseball miracle and then a kind of saint miracle. And the book seems concerned in a way that people have the opportunity to believe in a kind of sanctity. Many of them are doing penance. The hero seems to be like a saint on a pillar in the desert. He has exiled himself. And I wondered, first of all, this kind of saintliness seems new to a DeLillo novel.
At some point in the early stages of this book, I realized I would be heading back into my own background to some extent. And that means to my own Catholic background. And writing about nuns and priests, something I don't think I've done before, and writing very close to personal experience in some cases. Sooner or later, I began to understand that this would begin to influence the actions of the characters, and perhaps more tellingly, the themes of the book. And there is a kind of under-history in this book. The book essentially takes place in the shadow of the bomb. But there is an anti-history, there is an anti-historical element. The book traces the private moments, it traces the memories of certain individuals. And one of the things it eventually moves toward is a kind of religious manifestation, which happens in rather unconventional ways, so unconventional that we find a miracle in cyberspace.
It's fascinating because the symmetry is very complete. The opening sections are concerned with the Bruegel painting, The Triumph of Death, the closing sections about the Bruegel painting, about children's games. Each of these sections has a sort of dark or wicked figure who receives an annunciation. J. Edgar Hoover at the beginning, receiving from a messenger the news that the Russians have tested their first atomic bomb. Sister Edgar at the end, who has finally witnessed a necessary miracle. I think her miracle is finding the appearance of the street child on the billboard. And yet history is not in general something we think of as being symmetrical, or when we talk about the symmetry of history, we start thinking we're talking about paranoia. So it interests me that the book juxtaposes symmetry to chronology.
Well, you're right. History isn't necessarily symmetrical, but perhaps art is. And this is the way in which art attempts to make a certain coherent sense out of the vast, messy, three-dimensional construction that we call history.
I noticed, too, that in running chronologically backwards, the book begins in October of 1951 and ends sometime, one presumes, in the late 90s. But once it begins proper, it moves from the 90s back to the 50s. And as I was reading, I felt I was witnessing a cavalcade of literary styles and social styles, almost as if one were to speak chronologically. The book begins with a kind of language inflected by Old World Italian. The kids pick it up and speak mostly the street curses of the Italians. Lenny Bruce comes along and takes the street talk and turns it into the hyperbolic, what we used to call black comic thing. And then certain stratifications happen to Bruce talk. It turns ironic and anti-hyperbolic until it arrives at the very beginning of the novel in what might be called Don DeLilloese, the kind of micro-miniaturized, half-ironic, half-comic, poker-faced, and extremely concise. Almost a technology of what has happened to talk. And I wondered, since this book includes necessarily a bypass into literary naturalism, or at least gutter naturalism, what it was like to come back and be writing in the style that you began by writing against.
The book has many voices, but to me only one language, and that's American. I remember when one of my books was first translated into French, I received the French edition, and I was surprised and delighted to see a statement on the copyright page translated from the American, not from the English, from the American. And you're quite right to suggest that at some point, as the book moves backward into time, there is one section, part 6, in which the prose tends to become more naturalistic. And I'll tell you an interesting thing that happened, and it didn't happen until I was reading The Galleys. I suddenly began to understand that in that part of the book, set in the Italian Bronx in the early 1950s, all the literary touches I'd used earlier in the book, the fused words, the invented words, the hyphenated words, suddenly seemed to disappear. And I, in fact, did not do this intentionally. I suppose I naturally adopted the voice of that environment and those people who lived in those narrow streets.